Good afternoon, everyone. David, thank you very much for that kind introduction. And Stephen, to you and CEDA, can I thank you and CEDA for the opportunity, the privilege, in fact, of being able to speak for the first time publicly to an audience like this, apart, of course, from the media appearances since the publication of the final report. My colleagues and I on the panel really appreciate that opportunity, and I acknowledge CEDA. Ladies and gentlemen, can I also thank you for your interest in the work that you have turned out today in such numbers. Thank you as well, as David's intimated, for some people it can be a rather dry topic, but I'm delighted that you've shown interest in that by coming along today. May I also acknowledge one of my co-panellists, Sue McCluskey, at the front table down here. Thank you for coming today, Sue. And Christine Barron, who's at the back there. Christine was the secretary to the panel. She led a team of 16 public officials, senior officials from the Treasury Department, Department of Industry, some from the ACCC and other groups across the public service. May I say publicly, and I do so with great delight, that the support that we received from Christine and her team of senior members of the Australian Public Service was absolutely without parallel. We would not have achieved what we've managed to achieve in meeting deadlines, the depth of research I hope you agree you'll find in the final report, were it not for the professionalism of the people who worked on the Secretariat. So Christine, thank you once again very much indeed. Well, ladies and gentlemen, as you're aware, the final report, the Darshi Blows, was published on the 31st of last month and released by Minister Bilson at that time. Indeed, it's on a fairly heavy gauge paper, so it makes a nice thump when it drops on the Minister's table. As a consultant, those other consultants around the room, including my colleagues from Deloitte, will know exactly what I mean about the value of a report that goes thump. It's 540 pages or so, and what I intend to do in the next 30 minutes or so is to just lead you through some of the key themes. As you would appreciate, there's a lot of material there, a lot of detail. I won't handle all of that detail. You can take me there in questions if you like. If they're detailed questions, and I can see some of the lawyers already sharpening their pencils, if they're detailed legal questions, then I will simply say that I'm not a competition lawyer, as you know, and I may well hand those on or take them on notice, but in general, I'm very happy to take questions right across what is a very broad spectrum of a report. I mentioned Sue. Peter Anderson, of course, former Chief Executive of ACCI, and Michael O'Brien, QC, well known to lawyers in Melbourne. In fact, people beyond the legal fraternity. Michael, as I increasingly discover, has a reputation which is broadening all the time. I think he was on the list of best lawyers that was published recently in the Financial Review. The four of us were tasked with a very broad terms of reference, and in particular asked to engage in as many stakeholder meetings as we felt we could to ensure that the views that we eventually put to government, as we've done in this final report, we can say with hand on heart, have been thoroughly tested. That, of course, doesn't mean, as David just indicated, that everybody agrees with us. I mean, on the contrary, I wouldn't expect that. But what I would certainly expect is that as a result of all of the meetings that we undertook with stakeholders, nearly 1,000 submissions, 350 to our issues paper and 600 submissions then to the draft report, that everybody had a say. David was also kind enough to mention the international conference that we held after the publication of the draft report. We decided, the four of us, early in the piece that, to be blunt, we had better things to do than to traipse around the world trying to conduct meetings with foreign officials and others about what we should do with Australian competition law. But that didn't mean that we didn't think what was happening overseas was irrelevant, on the contrary. But we thought that it would be much more sensible to bring selected representatives here to Australia, experts in the competition law and practice, academics and lawyers here to Australia, and then to have a conference where invited guests from the fraternity of competition law and policy, they could hear what was being said to us at the same time that we heard it. And I think that that was a very important meeting for us in coming to see how people responded to the various ideas that we floated in the draft report. And I would commend that to others who are engaged in the process of public policy consultation as a way of much more efficiently engaging foreign views about what we propose here than, as I say, trying to make up running from one meeting to another in New York City or London or elsewhere. The context for an exercise like this is also very important. We've a series of reviews coming out, as you know, including the tax reform and others that have been mentioned in recent days. And oftentimes you'll hear people say in the context of these reports, this reform agenda is essential. It's essential for us to continue the momentum that is lagging now as the mining investment boom wanes. Australians have become used to the fact that mining investment in terms of trade effects have continued to drive our living standards. And it's not absolutely clear that many of our countrymen and women understand the strength of the downdraft on the growth of our living standards, which is arising as a result of the fact that that mining boom is waning. It will be replaced, of course, by an export boom, that's true. But that boom won't be anywhere near as sharp. It'll take a lot longer to work its way through. And in the meantime, we're living through the downdraft, as I say, of commodity price reductions, reductions in mining investment. So how are we going to sustain growth in living standards? The answer that economists will give you is productivity growth. Productivity growth is one of those chimerical phenomena. It's hard to know. You can identify, you can define it, but how do you actually bring it about? What is the magical formula? We don't know all there is to know about what drives productivity growth. We do know that it's an essential ingredient in driving living standards. And we also think that of all the things that you could do to try to encourage productivity growth, competition has to be up there on that list. Competition in the end, the vying, the bidding of sellers for your business, the fact that they will do and have to do whatever they can to win your business, putting a price down, improving the value proposition, making something a little bit newer, a little bit shinier. That process of competition drives innovation. It spurs us on. I often use a sporting analogy at this point because I think it's intuitive to Australians as we think about what makes for good sporting competition, what actually brings forth excellence in our sportsmen and women. We know it's the competitive cut and thrust of the sporting arena. And we also know that in that arena, that cut and thrust can get, particularly if it's a game like football, a contact sport, it can get pretty rough. And then again we know that good sport is not gladiatorial. It's certainly physical and strong, lots happening, and people get hurt. But there are rules which are strictly enforced. You speak about competition in that context, and I think most Australians find that intuitively obvious. It produces the best quality game, if you like, great watching. And now, of course, the AFL is a multinational corporation. It makes a lot of money. But it produces great sport, engages us in a process which is essentially about encouraging excellence. At a very grand level, it's that same logic which we're seeking to apply here in the commercial arena, the same sort of logic. Yes, the competitive process drives innovation. Innovation drives growth. And all of this can involve people losing their shirts. That's true. It needs to take place within the context of strictly enforced rules, just like the rugby league or the AFL or, in fact, any sport. Strictly enforced rules to ensure that it's the game that counts. It's not about advancing the interests of any individual competitor or putting lead in the saddle of any particular rider. It's about ensuring that this contest is fair, but it's vigorous. And out of that, of course, comes value. So one of the essential parts of the backdrop to this whole exercise is that issue that we face. How will we continue to drive the living standards for ordinary Australians? One answer is competition policy. And the four of us have offered to the government our recommendations for how Australia's competition policy, laws and institutions might be tuned up to give a stronger edge to the competitive process with that aim in mind. There's another part to it, of course, as well, and that is that lots of things have changed since the last time competition policy was reviewed in any systematic way by the Hilmer Review back in the early 1990s. Lots of things have changed, not the least of which being changes in the digital technology which is with us now, but was in many respects not even dreamt of when Fred Hilmer and his colleagues reported in 1993. After all, by some estimates, the World Wide Web was only switched on in 1996. But it isn't just digital revolutions. The growth of China, yes, it was perceived at that time, but we've now experienced that in real life, and the impact that that has had on the Australian economy has been completely transformative. As indeed, of course, is the population ageing phenomenon, once more observed in prospect in the early 1990s but increasingly part and parcel of the way we need to drive our economy, as the government's recent intergenerational report made clear yet again. So these three things are relevant too, because they mean that the competition policy, law and institutions that we're inquiring into, as far as possible, we haven't got a crystal ball any more than anybody else does, but as far as possible, should be fit for purpose, where the laws, the policies and the institutions are out of date or conspicuously misdirected in light of these major challenges that face us. Then what we've sought to do is to recommend reforms to ensure these things are more fit for purpose, better tuned, if you like, to current circumstances. So there's the reform challenge. This has a history to it. And I like to make this point. I think it's an important point to make. Some people have accused our report and our discussion of being quote-unquote academic. It's an indirect jibe at my former career. I think that that's completely wrong. I don't think it's academic at all. I think the ideas in here are not just practical. People understand what competition, yes, competition on the sporting field, they understand. I'm talking about competition in choice for your mobile phone plan, your ability to choose among a different set of electricity distributors. They understand what choice means. This is not new. We've had 20 years of experience in this area. People understand in some parts of our country what it means to have deregulated retail trading hours. You don't have to take our word for it, that if you deregulate trading hours, suddenly there will be no small businesses left. You don't need to take our word for it. Don't accuse me of idle speculation. Look for yourself. Amazing as it may strike, and does strike, some men and women in our country from different parts of Australia, this is the way life is for lots of Australians, particularly here in Victoria, but also in Tasmania and New South Wales. Trading hours have been deregulated. And lo and behold, outside the large supermarkets, there you see alive and well the specialist butcher shop, the specialist baker shop, the fruit shop. It simply is not true that deregulating retail trading hours drives small business out of business. Nor is it true that everybody has to work on a public holiday. On the Australia Day weekend, my wife and I went down to our local shopping centre to find a place open for a cup of coffee on the afternoon. Well, the first place we came across, there was a sign in the window, "We're off to the beach for Australia Day holiday. Have a happy holiday." And the next shop was also closed, and they said, "Sorry, we're closed for today. Open again tomorrow morning. See you then." And the third one was open. Now, these people made a choice to decide when to open and when to trade and when not to. It was a matter for them, which is precisely what we're saying. No one's obliged to trade all the time, but neither are you implicitly obliged to trade all the time, because if you didn't, you'd lose business massively to your competitors. That's a matter that you can decide for yourselves. Well, the Hilmer Review drove competition into the non-tradable parts of the Australian economy, following along from those great early reforms in the Hawke-Keating era, which included, as you'll recall, admitting foreign banks to our country and engaging in deregulation of the exchange rate and other changes that we remember that era for. In the early 1990s, Prime Minister Paul Keating at that time then unleashed the Hilmer Report, which went into the non-traded parts of the Australian economy. The traded goods sector, of course, was substantially affected by things like removing or lowering tariffs, deregulating the foreign exchange market. This time around, in this competition policy review, we have recommended taking competition even beyond that. In fact, right across the economy, and in particular into areas that the Hilmer Review never countenanced, into government itself and the services that government provides, human services. Let me answer a question that I expect somebody might ask. They've certainly asked it before. What do I consider the most important of the recommendations, that is to say, the one that's likely to make the biggest difference if it were implemented by the government? And I say government, I should say governments plural. To implement this will require changes not just by the Commonwealth, but also, of course, by all of the jurisdictional governments, the states and territories. And the answer to that question is quite clear. Human services. What do we say about human services? Why is that? Human services, health, education, welfare, is a rapidly growing part of the Australian economy. It's a bigger and bigger share of the national economic pie. It's also a bigger and bigger share of government outlays. So if you can realise improvements, not just in the cost of providing those services, that's important, but if you can improve the quality of those services, their flexibility, the diversity of those services, how innovative the providers of those services are, to meet an increasingly wide and changing array of preferences. If you can do that, you've got a chance of making a much bigger difference to the lives of ordinary Australians than doing many other things. So the most important, in our view, is clearly that. And it is a national challenge. The recommendations that are made in this report, ladies and gentlemen, apply to all levels of government. Some, of course, can only uniquely be implemented by the Commonwealth, as in recommended changes to the Competition and Consumer Act, and that's obvious, that's a Commonwealth Act, so the Commonwealth is responsible there. But in the other areas, including areas like human services, in many areas these are either jointly shared responsibilities of the Commonwealth and the states and territories, or they're uniquely the province of the states and territories. So there are benefits here, there are proposals here, there are ideas here for all of the jurisdictions. And in order for these ideas to be taken up, it doesn't require all of the governments to agree. Our view is that if there were a multilateral approach and all of the governments did agree to a national approach to this, as they did with the national competition policy following the Hilmer Report 20 years ago, that would have the greatest chance of delivering maximum benefits. I mean, I think that's sort of obvious. But if that can't be arranged for whatever reason, that doesn't mean this is a dead duck. On the contrary. And we've already seen this. The government of the Northern Territory and the ACT have already announced inquiries into the regulation of the taxi industry and passenger transport. They've already made a start there. In fact, there are a number of areas here where state governments have already started to think about ways in which competition could be introduced. So in thinking about where all this might go in a broader politico-economic context, I don't think that the outcome here is purely and simply the result of what's decided in the Commonwealth Parliament. In certain areas, that's obviously true, but it's not true across the spectrum of our recommendations. Well, how do we go about our business? Essentially, we asked ourselves a series of questions. There's no need here for you to read them. You can find them in the report, but they go to the sorts of matters you would expect us to ask, and they refer to the competition framework, the laws, the policies, the institutions. Do they focus on making markets work in the long-term interests of consumers, and if not, how could they be made to do so? Do they foster diversity, choice and responsiveness? Do they encourage innovation and entrepreneurship? Are the laws clear and reliable and practicable? Do they promote the efficient use of infrastructure and natural resources? And do they secure underlying standards of access and equity? These questions were filter questions, which we used as we thought about the policies, laws and institutions, and then decided how we thought they could be changed so as better to achieve these objectives. I mentioned the context for the review. It's important to remember that this is not new territory. We have experience of this. As I walked with my colleagues around the different parts of our capital cities and met with people individually and in groups, it wasn't hard at all to get people thinking about examples of how competition, the changes that had been introduced over the previous 20 years, had affected their lives. Can I also say that in all of those meetings and in nearly 1,000 submissions, nobody, not one, said, you know, this competition policy business you go on about is a complete failure, a complete crock. Those institutions should be abolished, the law should be abolished, it has failed to serve the interests of Australians. Nobody said that. Nobody said that. Why not? Well, it would be ludicrous to say that. People understand that competition is a very valuable thing, and they understand that across the political spectrum. You too, like me, would have seen the response that the Labor Party gave through Shadow Treasurer Chris Bowen to both the draft report and more recently to the final report. These are matters which, in great bulk, are shared across the political spectrum because of the innate wisdom and familiarity that we have in our country with the competitive process. So yes, there's experience here. There's a track record. This isn't some airy-fairy theory dreamt up by an ex-academic. There is actual, real track record that you can go and experience for yourselves. If not in every state, then certainly in parts of our country you can find out what it's like to be able to order in a supermarket and consume any variety of potato that you'd like. Going forward, of course, as I've indicated, this review was very much about fitness for purpose, thinking about how these competition laws, policies and institutions could be driven forward. Speaking of being driven forward, it'd be nice to have the next slide. There we go. And I mentioned those forces for change as well. These provide the context looking forward. And I think with due respect to Fred Hilmer and his colleagues on the Hilmer Review, there was less focus at that time on how to drive these policies into the future. We can't avoid that now because of the rapid pace of change and the fact, as you know, that digital technology is ubiquitous. And we're forever asking ourselves how that's going to change things. And it's changing landscapes and policies and laws in ways that people don't necessarily appreciate, and you can only see it dimly yourself. One example is this. In the Hilmer Report, there was quite some discussion of the news agent business. News agencies used to have the same type of location rules which still apply to pharmacists, rules which prohibited news agents from being located too close to one another for various reasons. The word newsagent doesn't appear in this final report. Why not? Because technology has just blown all of that away. It's just no longer relevant. Who's next? How do you design competition policies, laws and institutions when the technological change that is upon us can render them completely nugatory, just like that? Well, our recommendations, there are 56 of them in the final report, reach to policy, law and institutions in the same way that the 53 from the draft report did. There are relatively minor changes to the recommendation list, at least in the final report compared with the draft. There are 2 new policy recommendations you can see there. One relates to government procurement, to make it quite clear that we did have in mind that government procurement processes should have competition at their core. That's part and parcel of extending competition policy into the sphere of government, wherever government runs up against trade and commerce. Hilmer took it as far as government in business. This review takes it out beyond that point to wherever governments engage in activities that rub up against trade and commerce. There's a recommendation about informed choice, about the importance that we now have for people to have access to information in the right format, the right kind of information in the right format in order to drive the types of choices, particularly in the human services area, that we give such emphasis to. People pointed out to us that choice is a good thing, but you can't exercise choice unless you're appropriately informed. That's correct. So there's now a discussion in the final report which goes to that in more detail. We called the eventual response to Section 46. You'll recall in the draft there were a couple of options there. We've decided on that one, and you know what the final recommendation is. A recommendation about abolishing Section 47 and allowing Section 45, together with a reformed Section 46 to deal with the issue of exclusive dealing, and a separate recommendation on trading restrictions in industrial agreements, which various parties indicated to us and we agreed was given a once-over lightly in the draft report and needed more careful discussion. And then finally, in competition institutions, we again called our final recommendation on governance for the ACCC. So a relatively small number of changes. Quickly looking at the priority policy reforms that you'll see in the final report. There, I've mentioned human services. We've spoken about that already. The importance of separating policy regulation and the provision of the services. Contestability, driving choice. Another thing that Australians innately find distasteful. That's monopoly. That's when somebody has the arrogance to say, oh yeah, mate, this is all there is that's on offer. You pay this price, or you go without. Or you take this one, or you go without. That's something which sets the gall rising in most Australians. I understand that, you understand that. So when you talk to Australians about choice and contestability and unleashing forces which allow the seller to run down the street after you, saying, but please, what about mine? Take mine. That's the sort of thing that we understand. We want to unleash that in a measured way, protecting access and equity, of course, not in a doctrinaire way, into the area of human services, where increasingly people want to exercise choice. Why? Because our needs and preferences are widening all the time. Might have been a different matter for my grandparents, who've been raised to expect a certain thing and who came from a certain ethnic background and had a certain upbringing. But the community today doesn't look like my grandparents, bless them. It's extremely diverse, and therefore it needs a system which is much more adept to meet a widening set of preferences and tastes and needs. That's what underlies this recommendation. Introducing government into procurement and privatisation, thinking more carefully about intellectual property, particularly in the context of trade agreements that we negotiate as a country. Reforming transport systems, cost-reflective road pricing, abolishing sea and air cabotage, which see international airlines flying right across our great country, essentially in many instances half empty, because they can't fly people from Sydney to Darwin, and yet they're going that way anyway. Those sorts of rules we recommend be changed. Introducing competition into planning and zoning rules, and finishing the reforms that were started 20 years ago under Hilmer for electricity, gas and water. Even though Hilmer's 20 years old, it's still not true that all of our countrymen around Australia have the sort of choice of electricity retailer that we enjoy here in Victoria. And when people say to me, oh, well, you know, that's not really important, so you try taking that away from Victorians. You try telling them, no, forget it. You don't need choice of electricity distributor. You don't need choice of mobile phone plan or supplier of your telco services. You can just have one. See what happens. Why should the rest of Australians, at least in those jurisdictions where these things don't apply, be denied those choices? In the area of the law, let me move very quickly here. This is not my particular expertise, but these are the key recommendations you'll find there. Section 46 I've mentioned already, removing price signalling provisions which were just specific to banking. We didn't see any reason why that should be the case. We do believe that can be picked up under concerted practices that David mentioned earlier on in Section 45. More streamlined merger processes, to some extent concentrating together now the former roles of the ACCC and the ACT, the Competition Tribunal, to make that easier to work with. Simplifying the laws and extending the coverage of the law to trade and commerce, as I indicated. And then the competition institutions. Some folk have said, oh, well, you're wanting to introduce these new regulators at a time when the government is trying to get rid of regulators. That's not correct. Our proposal for an Australian Council for Competition Policy is a replacement for the National Competition Council, which served a very valuable role at the time of the National Competition Policy. We want an institution which will drive these reforms forward in the same way that the NCC did. So this would replace the NCC. Would have a number of differences, one of which is that the NCC was a Commonwealth body, it was a different era. This body would be a truly national body, that is to say it would be constituted and answerable to all of the jurisdictions jointly. In order to make sure that the jurisdictions, the states and territories, buy into these ideas. It's a different era from what it was when Professor Hilmer and the others were reporting 20 years ago. They need buy-in, they need influence, they need responsibility and accountability, and that's how we've designed the ACCP. The Access and Pricing Regulator, well, that's the Australian Energy Regulator carved out of the ACCC and given a broader remit, not just for energy but also for telcos, in fact for any network industry, which might even include overseeing road pricing. Network industries will become more important, not less. That is one of the outcomes of the digital revolution, that networks become important. We want a regulator which is focused on how you regulate those types of industries where network effects, where access and pricing issues are important. And finally, we adopted a more simplified proposal for resolving what we thought was an issue that needs to be dealt with in the ACCC. The ACCC, in the view of the panel, has too little separation between the governance of that organisation, between the role of the commissioners and the day-to-day management of the ACCC's affairs. As with other organisations, we'd like to see greater separation between the governing body and the day-to-day management of it. We've recommended that half of all of the commissioners be appointed on a part-time basis to make sure, or at least to give much higher probability, of that working out in practice. There are some brief recommendations here about small business. They're there because the terms of reference asked us to think about the specific situation of small business. I simply make the point that many of the recommendations in the final report will work for small business. You can just go through and draw a line from a number of the recommendations straight through to small business. Things like Section 46, if the government were to implement it in the way that we recommend, we believe, would assist small business, granting them better access to remedies by pointing small businesses to alternative dispute resolution schemes which already exist, promoting the development of industry codes, improving collective bargaining, collective boycott activities. Many of these things are already there. they aren't understood or not understood well enough, or the paperwork that's required to engineer them is clunky. So we've recommended that they be tuned up to facilitate small business in its dealings with large business especially. And then, of course, improving the competitive neutrality complaints process. So finally, we come to implementation. This is a new area for the final report. No comments about implementation in the draft. There is a full chapter, as you'd be aware, of the final report dealing with implementation issues. It makes the point, as I've already made to you, that many of these recommendations could be implemented unilaterally. It doesn't require multilateral agreement, as desirable as that may be. Naturally, there would be a benefit from a national approach, cooperation and collaboration, particularly on trials and pilots of some of these ideas. Use the Federation, use one of the strengths of the Federation, which is that you can start pilots and trials in certain jurisdictions for the others to watch to see what happens, and then to adapt the results of those pilots and trials for their own circumstances. That's using the Federation to perform one of its strengths. We are different in different parts of the Commonwealth, so use that. And many of the reforms build on momentum that's already been established. In the final report, you will see a roadmap. Once more, we're very keen to ensure that people don't think of these as a bunch of theoretical proposals. No, excuse me. Here is a list which indicates to you how you could prioritise them, which levels of government are responsible, what sorts of timeframes you might be looking at, and what the first steps would be in every case. We've prioritised, we've provided timelines. Indeed, we've even gone so far as to prepare model legislative provisions with the assistance of some others to get us to that point. You will find in the final report, if you haven't had a look at it, actual draft model law. So you needn't say, well, that's all very well in principle. I'd like to see what that looks like in black and white when it hits the statute book. Well, take a look. We've already had that discussion. And in there you will see model provisions, which isn't to say, of course, that if the government decides to adopt these proposals, it won't hand them to the drafts people and we'll get whatever the government wants drafted, naturally enough. The reason for putting that there is to help people focus on the practicability of these ideas. Well, ladies and gentlemen, as Stephen indicated at the outset, this final report now has been handed to government. The government has decided to engage in further consultation about the ideas put forward in this report for 8 weeks. And if you haven't already done so, you have your chance to comment on what we've said by making representations to the government through the Treasury. And the Minister's indicated that the government will respond to the report later this year. My colleagues and I on the panel believe that we have fulfilled the terms of reference that were given to us by the Minister. We spent a year of our lives working on this. We're very proud of the work that we've done. We're not suggesting, of course, that we're right in every respect, but what this represents is the opinion of 4 Australians who've had the benefit of input from a much larger set of Australians and thinking about these issues for a year. We commend the final report to the Australian government. Thank you.